Welcome everyone. Myself, Dr. Praveen Kumar Pathak. I am working as a professor at the Center for Study of Regional Development at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic related with understanding how demographic changes and the prospect of sustainable development are interrelated. What are the emerging issues and possible challenges that we have to address? Now, I want to draw your attention towards understanding the major global change and its possible drivers. So, if you think about the major global changes in terms of development that has unfolded over the last 6 to 7 decades, there are primarily two major forces responsible for these important changes. One is, of course, the advancement of human technology. And with the advent of human technology, particularly after the Second World War, there has been massive change in the scale of production and material advancement. There has been enormous progress in terms of agriculture productivity, green revolution. All of these changes have resulted into enormous material progress, particularly in the case of global North. On the other hand, if you compare the global South nation, particularly developing nations, many of which got independence after 1940s onwards, so most of these nations have a very different demographic situation as compared to the developed nations. And so therefore we have to understand how demographic composition and changes therein are responsible for determining the development prospects and how over time they both are responsible for changing each other. And so therefore demography is a critical factor which determines the prospects of development of any society. So I just want to show you this very interesting map which tells us the situation of fertility level in the global situation in 1950s and 55. Now if you look at this map, majority of the global South nation, developing economies, had a very high fertility level. So the total fertility rate, which is the average number of children that a woman will have if she survives her reproductive span and experience fertility schedule of different age group between 50 to 49. So on an average she had roughly about 7 to 8 children per woman. Most of these developing nations, including Asia, Africa and the Latin America. However, if we contrast the situation with some of the global North, the developed countries, even back in 1950s, so most of these countries had a TFR of in the range between 3 to 4 children. Now we have to understand how the level of fertility in any such society varies from each other. There are various important factors which result into higher fertility levels. There is no automatic factor which works to shape the fertility in any population. So if you look at, for example, the developing nations in 1940s had a very high fertility simply because those were times when mortality levels in these countries was phenomenally high. So the infant mortality in most of these countries was more than 250 infant deaths per 1,000 live births, which means that on every 1,000 live births, almost 200 plus children were not able to celebrate their first birthday. Life expectancy was fairly less at the time of birth. So which means that in order to have, suppose 3 to 4 children, the parent had to have at least 7 to 8 children so that to compensate for the higher risk of death, at least some of the children would survive. So this was one of the situation, and this was of course joined with other socio-economic and environmental conditions that prevailed in the society. So for example, there was huge problem of food insecurity. There was a critical problem of limited education, poor healthcare system, So all this led to higher fertility, and because access to education, particularly among women, was very limited, so what happened was women used to enter into childbearing and marriage at very younger ages. So which meant that they had a relatively larger reproductive time span wherein they would have number of children. So all these conditions led to very high fertility during 1950s, particularly in the case of global South. But also in relative sense, global north in 50s also had roughly 3 to 4 or 5 children. There also situation was very different from what it stands today. So at least if you compare the picture of global fertility today from what it was, say for example 70 to 80 years ago, it only tells us that if we make conscious decision at the policy level, at various government levels, we can shape the process of demographic changes. And so therefore it is important for us to understand that policy making is critical for shaping the trends of demography of any society, and it is very much linked with development prospects. So if you think about fertility as one of the parameters of demographic change, then what conditions are responsible for higher fertility, and what can we do in order to bring changes so that fertility may come down, and why do we think that higher fertility or lower fertility, what is the implication? So the implication is also important for us to understand. So higher fertility means number of implications for women, for family, for children, for society, and for nation as a whole. So for instance, if there are large number of children in the family, it means that per children availability of resources will be smaller. It means that money spent for education of each children would be limited. It means that quality of nutrition and diet that children would get would be limited. It also means that all the opportunities that the parents in the family can afford to provide would not be the best but the modest one that they can afford with the limited resources that the family has. And it also means higher risk of health issues, burden. So at the end of the day, large family brings a lot of challenges, and of course there are certain positive implication, but that only resonates in societies which are traditional agrarian based. So in those societies where you had requirement for large families for taking care of agriculture field, animals, etc., that was fine. But as global economy is changing, as the production system is changing, people are now moving from primary sector towards secondary and tertiary sector, as the employment opportunity are transitioning from agriculture based to industries based. So now people are moving from a large family size towards small family size, and this change in the desire for family is because of complex play of economic and social forces. So as economy is changing, so as society also responding to these economic changes. Now with rising education, particularly among women, what is happening is that women are spending now more years in schooling, in university and colleges, which means that investment in female education helps in building human capital. They also acquire skills, they also acquire capacities to contribute in economic activities, earn for themselves, earn for the family, and contribute to nation building. So which means that if you spend more time in education and skill building, it also means you spend less time in child rearing and childbearing. So this compensation allows economies and nation and societies to progress. It also means fewer children, you can invest more resources in fewer children. You can bring more quality children. You can invest better in their nutrition, in their skill building, in their education, in their co-curricular activities, etc. So in this way, the burden of having large children, or you may say, the implication of having large children on the women, on the family, on the society is very different. If you have large number of children in any society, it means that the society needs to apportion its resources into sectors where you need to invest into the growth and well-being of children, schooling, etc., which is good. But as fertility goes down, with changing economy, rising female education, better economic opportunity for women, it allows women also to come out and participate in economic activities, and allows the society and nation to progress on two fronts. Earlier if only men were shouldering responsibility, now women are also equally contributing. So this leads to a rapid increase in prospects of economic growth, and several East Asian tiger economies were benefited out of these kinds of policies, gender egalitarian policies, investing into female education, creating better opportunities for both men and women. So all these kind of demographic changes were very much helpful in bringing about rapid economic growth. So if you see the situation of fertility levels today, in majority of the world, fertility levels have collapsed. Majority of the world, the TFR is almost below replacement level, which is each couple now is being replaced by another couple. So gradually the global population, which is right now almost 8 billion, is likely to stabilize by 2050. And then projections of United Nations suggest that by 2100 the global population will stabilize around 9 to 10 billion people. Now the point is that majority of these people are likely to be concentrated in developing nations, and many of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia still have relatively higher levels of fertility, again because of factors such as public health systems need to be improved more. There is a greater prospect for investment into women education and skill building, etc. There is a greater need to invest in education for population as a whole. So when all this positive change happens, then fertility will further go down. However, if you try to understand why in most of the Western society fertility is at a situation which is lowest low fertility, where in many countries fertility is as low as 1.2, 1.1, 1.3. which means that each couple is being replaced by less than one couple. Now, which means that number of children is actually coming down in absolute number in most of the Western society, and we have to think about why it is happening and what are the implications of these fertility patterns in some of these Western society. So the lowest fertility in these Western society is an outcome of the fact that as economy progresses and reaches an advanced stage, couples or partners, they have to decide between quantity and the quality of children. And because of the changing family systems in most of these nations, what is happening that most of these couples are staying as a nuclear family, where there is hardly any support from grandparents or siblings. So childbearing and child rearing is essentially responsibility of couples or their partners. Now in most of these nations, you have relatively better gender equity as compared to developing nations. So both couples have to negotiate and plan and discuss and deliberate about shouldering the responsibility of the baby together. And because when these countries are at higher level of economic growth, so having a children means both couples are deciding together to forego some of the opportunity. So this opportunity cost is quite significant in many of these Western economies, and because of the opportunity cost, the couples decide many cases to focus more on their career and economic stability, and therefore decides to forego additional babies. So most of the couple are now going for just one kid, and that's why you see that fertility is coming down. And it's also because mortality in most of this nation is very much controlled, so most of the people are living longer and healthier lives, and therefore in most of these Western societies life expectancy hence tends to be typically 80 years and above. However, if you contrast with developing nations, we have life expectancy is roughly between 55 to 60 or 65 years, most of the developing nations today. So life expectancy again is an outcome of collection of economic, social and development factors which determine the prospects of the length of life of any population. So for example, in a global society today, on an average the life expectancy is about 72 years. So if a kid is born today, he or she is expected to live for about 72 years on an average. However, if the kid is born suppose in Japan or somewhere in Nordic countries, he or she may expect to live more than 85 or 90 years. And if he or she is born in somewhere, so for example Lesotho, Rwanda, etc., then he or she may expect to live somewhere about 55 or years or so on average at the time of birth. So which clearly suggests that even today, by the accident of Almighty, if somebody is born in one geography versus other, his or her life cycle is many times very much determined by the condition, the context where the kid is born. So by virtue of being born in a given state, your life expectancy is largely determined. So these important demographic changes tells us that role of society, nation, government and policy making for responsible demographic change is very important. Whatever has happened in the history of demographic change of any society can never be undone. But at whatever crossroad we are standing in the demographic journey of any society, we can make conscious decision today so that we plan for the future course of demographic trends. And these demographic trends, whether mortality change, fertility change or migration, together determines the population distribution, population composition and the characteristics of the people who live in a particular place. Now let's take case of India. So based on the census data of India since 1801 till the recent time, we see that India's demographic journey has been rather gradual and very much very interesting. So at the time of independence, the population of India was roughly about 36 or 360 millions, and today we are almost close to 1.4 billion people. So in the last 70 years or so, India's population has increased almost close to 4 to 5 times, which means that this rising population on the one hand presents new opportunities because we are a very young nation. Major of these people, if you look at the composition of our age structure, majority of people are less than 40 years of age, 25 years of age. 40% of Indians are less than 25 years of age. Very youthful country. Almost 65% of people are less than 35 years of age. And most of these young people are living in different settlements in rural areas, villages, smaller cities, towns. There's huge diversity in our youth population. And now they are looking for better skills, better education, better training, better health, better livelihood opportunities. So this is the time for countries such as us to invest, such as, if you take case of China, one of the biggest, the major policy decision which China took in early 80s was investing heavily into public education. So they spent almost for 40 years more than 8 to 10% of their GDP into public education. And what it has led? It has led to tremendous benefits in the long run for the Chinese economy. And we all know that, how China is now emerged as one of the strongest economy in the modern times. And so therefore, if countries plan well in advance, like India today is using several programs of starting from Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, and today we are focusing on Skill India. New education policy has come talking about changing the whole education system, wherein education just not focused on what the researcher, academician or the text, but rather we are thinking what is the interest of the students, what are the emerging areas. We are also focusing on multiple exit points, so that if the kids are able, if they have to for some reason come out from the education, they will get some certification, so that whatever time they have invested in seeking education get some credit. So all this has led to finding numerous opportunity of employment and job creation. And so in this way our youth will be more motivated to further go and seek education, training and skill building, and contribute to his or her own personal enhancement and consolidating his or her family condition, also enabling state and nation also to become economically prosper. So this is the right time for a nation such as us to invest in our young people. Now if you see that how India's demographic situation has evolved over the period of time. So to begin with, in early 1950s and 60s, our population was a typical population pyramid, where large proportion of population was less than 14 years of age. and today in around 2020, it's a remarkable change that we see in the population composition today. As you can see, the share of children are declining in our population, and the net producers, which is population in the working age category, is now actually increasing. So this means that as the population in the working age category is rising, we have more proportion of net producers in the economy as compared to elderly and child population. So this is a very important but transitory phase in the demographic journey of any society, where you have relatively more proportion of people in the working age categories. So if these people were to get the best education, skill building, health facilities, nutrition, quality of life, so they can really help economy to go in a very different trajectory of economic growth, provided if the macroeconomic situation and the government structure in the country is stable and strong. And so therefore demography is very critical implement in predicting the future course of any society. And if you look at the future demographic journey for India, so in 2050 India looks like something like this, where now this working age people move to advanced ages, and it very much becomes a barrel shape later in the later half of the 21st century, where large proportion of Indians would pass on their working age and enter into advanced ages, and population aging will be a new issue for India. Like even today, if you look at absolute number, more than 100 million people, 10 crore people in the country are above 60 years of age, senior citizens. Now senior citizen, of course, is a big challenge for society in terms of providing for social security, healthcare costs, and also economic opportunities for elderly population. So that is another challenge. So for example, states such as Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, all these states which are relatively advanced in the demographic transition journey than the northern states of India or other northeastern states. So they are already modifying their development and policies to respond to the changing age composition of population in their society. For example, in most of states, for example in case of Kerala, as the population of children has come down, so what they are doing is they are shutting down the schools because there is not enough kids to go to the schools. So rather what they are doing is converting these schools into the old age homes, or as places where elderly can come and seek skills and training and remain economically productive, or just sit together and gel together and have a good social life. So these kinds of social and policy changes which are working in some of these southern Indian states. So these are all responding to the changing population composition at different stages of demography of any country. Now another important demographic change is the urbanization. Now urbanization, as we all know, is when people move from rural to urban areas, and in Indian context there are different ways of defining urban as compared to other part of the world. So there is no uniform definition, but as proportion of people increase in urban areas, this urbanization is rising in India. Today roughly 30% of Indians live in urban center. Globally 50% of people are living in urban sector. This is another very important demographic change. As majority of people are living away from rural society to urban society, what are the implications? So if you look at Sustainable Development Goal 11, that talks about creating sustainable communities and cities. So there is a huge challenge for creating cities that are sustainable. What does that mean? It means that cities that could afford a population size has a resource to provide all kinds of basic requirements for human population. So for example, if you compare today's different major cities in the country, we have more than 53 million plus cities in India today. There are more than 8,000 different sizes of cities in India today, of different categories, but majority of biggest cities and towns and metropolitan cities, they are growing in a very large proportion as compared to cities of moderate and or smaller sizes. So which means that pressure on the bigger cities is rising. What kind of pressure? So pressure in terms of providing urban services, whether it is transportation, electricity, education, governance, planning. So all these are challenges that is emerging because of this wave of urbanization that we are witnessing today.